They walked out of that building together, and nothing between them was ever quite the same again. Small decisions, the ones that don't feel like decisions at all, until later, when you're lying awake, replaying the exact moment you said yes. If you know that feeling, this part was made for you. Subscribe, leave a like, and tell us where you're listening from today. Now let's get back to Caleb and Mackenzie, because what happens next, neither of them was ready for. They walked to a place called Milo's, 4 blocks from the apartment. A corner bar with low lighting, mismatched stools, and the kind of menu that committed fully to comfort food without apologizing for it. Caleb had been there before. Mackenzie hadn't, which told her something small but specific about how differently they moved through the same neighborhood. They took a booth in the back. She ordered a beer she didn't particularly want because it was the first thing she saw, and he ordered the same without looking at the menu, and for a few minutes they just existed in the noise of the place. Other people's conversations, the low current of music from somewhere she couldn't identify. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said. Then, because it was true and she was tired of performing otherwise, "I hate that he still thinks showing up is an option." Caleb turned his glass slowly on the table. "How long were you together?" 3 years. She paused. "Long enough that I stopped noticing how much I was adjusting myself to fit." He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone with nothing to say, but of someone deciding how much of a response to offer. What kind of adjusting? She considered deflecting. She didn't. Smaller opinions, safer choices. The kind of editing you do so gradually you don't realize you've changed the whole draft. She took a drink. "Anyway, that's done." Caleb nodded slowly. There was something in his expression she couldn't fully read. Not pity, nothing that soft, something more like recognition. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You made a face." "I don't make faces." "You made one just now." The corner of his mouth moved. That almost smile she was beginning to catalog. "I was just thinking that it takes more self-awareness than most people have to describe that clearly." She looked at him. "That might be the most words you've said to me at one time." "Don't get used to it," she laughed. A real one, short and unguarded, and something in his chest shifted at the sound of it in a way he had no interest in examining at a bar on a Saturday night. He had told himself the Derek situation was simple instinct, protective reflex, the kind of thing any decent person would do. He was finding that explanation increasingly difficult to sustain. They stayed for 2 hours. The conversation moved. Her work, his, a brief and unexpectedly funny exchange about the worst clients they'd each survived, and somewhere in the second hour, she had turned toward him in the booth without noticing, and he had not moved away. When they walked back, the night had cooled, and she pulled her jacket tighter, and their arms brushed twice without either of them stepping aside. At the apartment door, she found her keys and turned to say something ordinary and ending. But when she looked up at him, whatever she'd planned evaporated. He was already looking at her, steady, unhurried. The way he looked at things he was deciding what to do with. "Good night, Mackenzie," he said quietly. He went inside first. She stood in the doorway for a moment, her heart doing that unreasonable thing again, and understood with uncomfortable clarity that she was in considerably more trouble than she'd originally budgeted for. The following week changed things in a way that was harder to ignore. It wasn't one moment, it was the accumulation of them. The coffee that started appearing on the counter for her before she woke up, without discussion or acknowledgement. The evening he came home to find her frustrated and stuck on a project, and sat across from her at the kitchen table for 20 minutes, asking questions about the client brief with the focused patience of someone who genuinely wanted to understand. The way he had started leaving the workbench lamp on when he went to bed because he'd noticed she sometimes worked late and the overhead light gave her headaches. Small things, the kind that don't announce themselves. Mackenzie noticed all of them. She kept a careful internal record and then told herself the record meant nothing, which was the kind of logic that only works for so long. It was a Wednesday night when the careful distance finally ran out of room. She had been working late, the apartment quiet around her, when she heard him come in from what must have been a long job. Later than usual, the particular heaviness of someone who had spent everything they had on physical work. She looked up when he passed the kitchen doorway. He had a cut on his forearm just below the elbow, not deep, but open, still tracking a thin line of red. "You're bleeding," she said. He looked down at it like he'd forgotten. "Job site, it's fine." "It's not fine. It needs to be cleaned." She was already up, already moving to the bathroom cabinet where she'd seen a first aid kit weeks ago, and filed the information away without knowing why. He sat on the edge of the bathroom counter because she asked him to, and she stood between his knees to reach the cut properly, and neither of them commented on the proximity because acknowledging it would have required admitting how much it mattered. She cleaned the cut with steady hands, and he watched her face while she worked. The small crease of concentration between her brows, the way she bit the inside of her cheek when she was focused. He was close enough to catch the scent of her hair, and he kept his breathing even and said nothing. "You should be more careful," she said quietly. "Probably," he said. She looked up then and found his eyes already on her, close and direct and carrying something he hadn't bothered to hide this time. The air in the small bathroom contracted. Her hands had stopped moving. She was still holding his arm. "Caleb," she said. Not a question, not a warning. Just his name, in a voice that came out lower than she intended. He reached up slowly and moved a strand of hair from her face. Just that, just one unhurried motion, and let his hand rest at her jaw for a moment that lasted longer than either of them planned. Then he dropped his hand, looked down. "Thank you," he said, "for this." She stepped back, gave him the space, but her hands were unsteady as she put the kit away, and she knew without question that he had felt exactly what she had felt. The question was what either of them was going to do about it. She didn't sleep well, not because of regret. There was nothing to regret technically, but because her body hadn't gotten the message that technically was the operative word. She lay in the dark and replayed the weight of his hand at her jaw, the specific warmth of it, the way he'd looked at her like he was done pretending he wasn't looking. By morning, she had convinced herself that the most reasonable response was to simply continue existing normally. She was good at that. What she hadn't accounted for was Caleb. He was in the kitchen when she came out, and something about him was different. Not distant, not awkward, but decided, like a man who had spent the night arriving at a conclusion and was no longer interested in arguing against it. He looked up when she walked in and held her gaze for a beat longer than the functional version of a morning greeting required. "Coffee's fresh," he said. "Thanks," she said, reaching past him for a mug. He didn't move back the way he usually did. She poured her coffee with the warmth of him at her side and kept her eyes on the cup and told her nervous system to behave itself. That evening, she called Joanna. She took the phone to her room, closed the door, and sat on the floor with her back against the bed, the way she used to in college when a conversation needed containment. "Something is happening," she said. "With the roommate," Joanna said. "Not a question." "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to. You've mentioned him 4 times in the last 2 weeks while actively trying not to mention him." A pause. "What kind of something?" Mackenzie pressed her palm flat against the floor. "The kind I don't know what to do with." He doesn't perform anything, Joe. He just is what he is, and he actually sees me, and I don't know if I'm reading something real or if I'm just lonely and healing and projecting. I was going to say, confused. "Same thing, sometimes." Joanna's voice softened. "But also sometimes, it's just real." "What does it feel like?" Mackenzie thought about his hand at her jaw. The coffee on the counter every morning. The way he had stood beside her when Derek showed up, not in front of her, beside her. "Terrifying," she said quietly. "It feels terrifying." "That tracks," Joanna said. Are you going to do anything about it? No, she said. Absolutely not. He's my roommate and I just got out of a disaster and I'm finally stable and… Mackenzie. What? You're already in it. She opened her mouth to argue, closed it, because Joanna was right, and she knew it, and the knowing sat in her chest like something warm and inconvenient. What she didn't know, couldn't know, was that on the other side of the wall, Caleb had stopped moving the moment he heard her voice through it. He hadn't intended to overhear, but he'd caught enough to understand that whatever was building between them, she felt it too. He stood very still in the hallway for a long moment. Then he went to his room, sat on the edge of his bed, and stared at the floor with the expression of a man who had just run out of reasons to wait. He knocked on her door the next evening. Not late, just after 9, when the apartment had settled into its nighttime quiet and the rain had started again against the windows. She opened it to find him standing in the hallway with no particular excuse prepared, and she understood immediately that this was different from every other time he had appeared in a doorway. I heard you last night, he said, through the wall. I wasn't trying to. She went very still. How much did you hear? Enough. His eyes were steady on hers. I think you should know that whatever you're trying to talk yourself out of, I'm not interested in pretending I don't feel it too. The directness of it hit her somewhere below her ribs. This was the thing about Caleb. He didn't circle. When he finally decided to say something, he said it clean. That's a lot to put on the table, she said. I know. He leaned one shoulder against the door frame. You don't have to do anything with it. I just didn't want you working through it alone when I'm standing 20 feet away, feeling the same thing. She looked at him for a long moment. The steadiness of him, the patience, the complete absence of pressure in his posture, even while saying something that required considerable courage. And she thought about every version of herself that had gotten smaller to fit someone else's space, about how this man had never once asked her to adjust. She stepped back from the door. An invitation, not a retreat. He came in. The room felt different with him in it, warmer, more specific, like the space had been waiting for exactly this arrangement. She sat on the edge of the bed, and he sat beside her, close but not touching, and for a moment they just let the rain fill the silence. I'm scared, she said, not an apology, just true. I know, he said. So am I. That surprised her. She turned to look at him and found him already looking at her, something open in his expression that she hadn't seen before. Not vulnerability exactly, but the particular honesty of someone who has decided that armor is no longer worth the weight. She reached over and took his hand, simple, no performance. Just her fingers closing around his, and his hand turning to hold hers back with a steadiness that felt like a promise made without words. When he kissed her, it was slow and certain, the kind of kiss that doesn't ask for permission because it already knows the answer. She felt the warmth of his hand moving to her face, her jaw, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone like she was something worth being careful with. She kissed him back with everything she'd been carrying for weeks, the wanting and the fear and the relief of finally putting something down. Outside, the rain kept going. Inside, there was only warmth and closeness, and two people who had spent long enough pretending they didn't need exactly this. When they finally pulled back, she rested her forehead against his. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. His arms came around her and she let herself be held, fully, without editing a single part of herself, for the first time in longer than she could honestly remember. Morning came differently now. Not dramatically, no grand transformation, no version of themselves they didn't recognize. Just the particular softness of waking up and knowing that something true had been said and hadn't been taken back. Mackenzie opened her eyes to gray Portland light and the sound of Caleb already moving in the kitchen, and for the first time in months, her first conscious thought wasn't logistical. It was just him. She found him at the stove, and when he heard her, he turned and looked at her the way he had the night before. Open, unhurried, without the careful containment he'd worn for weeks. He handed her a coffee and she took it and stood beside him, and that was enough. No performance required. But ease, she had learned, was never the whole story. By mid-morning, she was at her desk, and the quiet had given her too much room to think. The thing about letting someone in was that it immediately raised the stakes of losing them. She knew this about herself, the way fear had a delayed reaction, showing up not in the moment of vulnerability, but in the daylight after. Dressed in practical clothes and carrying spreadsheets, she thought about what she'd built here, freelance income that was finally stabilizing, a routine that worked, an arrangement that had, until recently, been uncomplicated. She thought about what happened to arrangements when feelings got into them. She had evidence on that question. The evidence was not encouraging. Caleb came to the doorway around noon. He read her the way he always did, accurately and without making a production of it. "You're in your head," he said. "I'm working," she said. He came in anyway, sat in the chair across from her desk, and waited, which was somehow more disarming than any argument. "I don't want to wreck this," she said finally. "The living situation, the whatever we'd been before last night. If this goes wrong, I lose all of it." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a real concern," he said. "I'm not going to tell you it isn't." She looked up. She had expected reassurance. The absence of it was somehow more grounding. "What I can tell you," he continued, "is that I'm not Derek. I don't have a version of this where I'm performing something I don't mean." He held her gaze steadily. "I'm not asking you to stop being careful. I'm asking you to let careful mean something different than stopped." She turned that over slowly. Let careful mean something different than stopped. She wanted to write it down. She wanted to argue with it. She wanted to cross the room and put her hands on him and stop thinking entirely, which was probably its own kind of answer. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay," he said. He got up, came to her desk, and pressed a single kiss to the top of her head, brief and certain, before walking back out to the kitchen. She sat very still for a moment, then she closed her laptop, stood up, and followed him. 3 weeks later, the shelf above her desk held 2 coffee mugs, hers and one that had migrated from the kitchen so gradually neither of them had commented on it. Small evidence of a life rearranging itself around a new truth. It was a Sunday when it became fully real, not in a dramatic way, just the specific Sunday when Mackenzie looked around the apartment and understood that she had stopped treating it like temporary shelter and started treating it like home. The distinction mattered. She had learned the hard way that home wasn't an address. It was the particular ease of being somewhere you didn't have to perform. Caleb was at the workbench finishing a small cabinet door for a client, and she was on the couch reading, and the apartment was full of the sounds of 2 people who had figured out how to share a space without losing themselves inside it. Outside, Portland was doing its gray and steady thing, rain tapping the windows, the city quiet on a slow morning. She watched him work for a moment without announcing it, the focused set of his shoulders, the patience in his hands. She thought about the version of herself who had stood at his door with a worn bag and a 3-point plan for not needing anyone. That woman felt both very close and very far. He looked up and caught her watching. He didn't make anything of it, just held her gaze with that steady, unhurried quality that had undone her from the beginning. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. Then, "I'm glad I answered that listing." He set down his tool and turned fully toward her, the one that said no drama. "You've been very low drama," she said, "relatively." He crossed the room, and she unfolded herself from the couch to meet him, and when he cupped her face in both hands, she felt the familiar warmth of someone who handled things carefully because he understood their value. He kissed her slowly, no urgency, no performance. Just the full and unhurried weight of a man who had decided and wasn't looking back. She pressed her hands flat against his chest and kissed him back with everything she had, and when they finally broke apart, she kept her forehead resting against his. "I'm not going anywhere," he said quietly. not a promise made in a rush. A fact delivered by someone who meant it the way he meant everything, completely. "I know," she said, and she did. Outside, the rain softened. Inside, everything was exactly warm enough. And that's where we leave them. Not at the beginning of the story, but at the beginning of everything after. If this one stayed with you, drop your rating in the comments, 1 to 10. Tell us what hit hardest. Every comment, every like, every moment you spent with Caleb and Mackenzie means more than you know. Thank you for being here for this one. We'll see you in the next story.